Okay, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I'm excited to talk to you about education today. So today I'm going to cover a topic at length that you have all requested so that I can hopefully clarify the differences in education in the US compared to New Zealand, the way things are run, how it's organized, how the schedule looks. And then at the end of the video, I will also talk about my thoughts on education and is one better than the other? How do they vary? What has just been my personal experience with it. So stay tuned. We're going to talk about education today. Okay, the first thing I'm going to talk to you today about is early education in New Zealand compared to the US. Now, I grew up in the US, if you don't know me. I have 4 kids that also went through school in the US. We have been in New Zealand for 4 years, so I also have experience with some of the early education programs. And then I also have experience in primary, intermediate, and college here in New Zealand. So let's talk about early education. So the programs here in New Zealand are really amazing. For example, they have this program here, and sorry if I can't remember exactly what it's called, but new moms get like 20 hours of free daycare is what you'd say in the States, childcare, or they could go to kindy is what they call here, or like any sort of type of daycare or kindergarten that they want to, and the government pays for 20 hours of it. And when I've asked Kiwis why this is, like, how do we have this program? And they're like, well, moms need to go shopping, they need a little break from the kids, they need to take some time, and it's good for the kids to socialize. And like, that's really mind-blowing for an American. Like, we all would love that, but we don't get that. So that's a really great program here. Then they also have something that's called Play Center, which is like in every community, and it was started by moms for moms. And so what you can do is you can take your kid to the Play Center. I believe generally the rule is that you can come and volunteer for one day, and you can drop your kid off for the rest of the week for like a 2 or 3 hour period where Play Center is open. And that all varies by which one you go to and which center and what resources they have, because it's all donated from the community or designed through the moms in the area. But it's a really great time for them to make some friends, to get to know other moms with kids the same age in your area, and just a really great place to go to break up your day between nap time. Bernardo's, I think, is where my son used to go, and was a really great experience. So how does this compare to early education in the US? Well, we don't have any of that. If you need to go to work and your kid needs to go somewhere, you are paying for very expensive daycare. That's your option. No government help, no nothing. I believe also in New Zealand, when you have a baby, the government gives you some money. I can't speak to that because I've never experienced it. But I know friends that have, and people have mentioned it to me. And so you just feel very supported as a mother here, and especially if you're a first-time mother, with plenty of options for you to maintain a little sanity, to get away a little bit, get your kid involved in things, to do things that are, you know, adult-like, go out for a coffee with somebody without having to drag your kid with you all the time. And that's just a really amazing option. So that's a little bit about the preschool ages, like 3 to 5 here in New Zealand compared to the US. Okay, secondly, let's talk about elementary or primary age students. So in New Zealand and the US, you all start school between the ages of 5 and 6 years old. But in New Zealand, you start year 1 through year 6 would be primary in general. Now, I don't know everywhere in New Zealand or if they do it differently. What's interesting about New Zealand that's very different than the US is like nationalized education, whereas in the States, each state, each county, each city will have kind of its own education system. So you can very well go to a state that does not have good education, another state that has really great education. So that's always a big deal for parents about where you're living or where you end up settling down, buying a house, that sort of thing. So, but in New Zealand, it's run nationally. And so what's great about that is that the kids are getting the same education no matter where they go. Now, they do divide up the schools by deciles, which is kind of a little bit about how much government will pay for things or not based on the needs of the community. But in general, it's what they're actually learning should technically be all the same. So that's kind of cool and very different. So elementary school in the US will generally be grade 1 through grade 5. And you would start at 5 or 6 years old. In the States, they have like kindergarten for 4-year-olds, kindergarten for 5-year-olds, and in some places they'll have kindergarten for 3-year-olds. But that all just depends, and that's just something that you can send your kid to that may or may not cost money. But generally you start school in first grade at 6 years old, 5 or 6 years old, depending on when your birthday is. Primary in New Zealand compared to elementary in the States is different, I would say. I've had most of my kids go through various grades or years of elementary school and primary school here and in the States. It's a little bit hard for me to compare like the education per se, because my kids in the States went to a rigorous kind of hard education system. And so it wasn't like the public system. So that wasn't like what I grew up with. But here, they're just going to whatever the local school was. And so just some highlights on primary school compared to elementary school in the States. Like, I really like how New Zealand really embraces the whole person, the whole student, and teaching them and making them do all sorts of different things. Test out every sport, test out drama, test out music, try all sorts of things. They're very much into not stressing the children out comparatively. Now, I get a lot of responses from some of you like, oh, I was always stressed out, or like, what I'm saying is compared to the US, it's not the same. If my elementary school kid was late for school, we would get a detention. It was like strict, and, lots of testing and lots of standardized testing, and just like in some areas, higher expectations, and it wasn't more of the learning through play like you have here. So in general, that's some of the differences. So primary school here in New Zealand is year 1 through year 6, and in the States is grade 1 through grade 5. So I hope that clarifies some of your questions about elementary primary school. Okay, the third topic I'd like to talk about is intermediate or middle school or junior high, as we would say in the States. So my experience in New Zealand to me that intermediate is years 7 and 8. In the States, it can be 6, 7, and 8. It could just be 7 and 8. It kind of depends. Like I said, each state is different, each government is different, and how the education is run can be different. You go to private school, you could have a completely different education, completely different focus. Middle school years, we all remember those. Those were rough days. Lots of changes, lots of weirdness, lots of trying to figure out who you are. And so in terms of like the education here compared to the US, it's similar. Like, it depends on your school here, because my kids have gone to different intermediate schools, and some have the kids all stay in one classroom and some have them switch classes. In the US, same thing. They generally will switch some classes, but then they kind of have that core group that moves around. I mean, that's how it was for me. And, that's when you start to play instruments and that sort of thing, foreign language, a little bit more of that. But in general, I wouldn't say that intermediate is a whole lot different between the US and New Zealand. So again, in summary, the US is grades 6, 7, 8, sometimes just 7, 8 for junior high, middle school is what we would call it. And here in New Zealand, intermediate is generally just years 7 and 8. Okay, and finally we've come to high school or college, as they say in New Zealand. And let's talk a little bit about what those grades look like. So in the US, you go to high school in grade 9. So you've got 7 and 8 in intermediate or junior high, and then you go to grade 9, 10, 11, and 12. So it's freshman is year 9, sophomore is year 10, junior is year 11, and senior is year 12. And so that would be the same across the board in all high schools in the US. And in New Zealand, you start year 9 and 10 is considered like your junior years, and then you start the NCA program years 11, 12, and 13. So I think generally students will graduate a little bit older here in this country, which I think is good in New Zealand because, you know, just a little extra time to grow up is not a bad thing for students. So that's a little bit of the difference. And the big difference is that they call it college. And so that can get very confusing because if you're watching any sort of American TV or movies, they're talking about college is the same as university. And so that can be very different and confusing. But high school and college is university in the States. And here in New Zealand, it's college, it's high school, and then uni or university is, you know, whatever you go to after that. So that's a little bit of the difference in the grades. And generally, a couple things that you might be interested to know, you generally can apply for a driver's license when you're 15. You get your temporary license, and you can start practicing and driving. And then when you turn 16, you can apply for your full license. And once you pass the test, you get it. So most people can drive when they're age 16. Whereas in New Zealand, it's quite different. You go and take your test when you're 16, where that enables you to be like the learner, and you can start practicing driving. And then 6 months later, you can go for your restricted test where you can now drive, but only by yourself. And then you have to wait like 2 years before you can get your full license. So generally people, if they're staying right on task, are not driving with full licenses until they're 18 in this country compared to the US, which would be more of 16. So that's a little bit about high school, college in the US compared to New Zealand. Okay, so finally, here are my thoughts on education in New Zealand compared to the US. So is New Zealand education better? Is the US education system better? I would say no, neither of them are better. I would say that they're just very different. So different doesn't mean one's better than the other. Each one has its own pros and cons compared to the other, but in general, I would just say that they're pretty different. Some highlights that I would say is that New Zealand does really well in encompassing the whole person. And I know that in primary, my kids were like, they took swimming in school and they got marks for that. They were drama and music and playing instruments and that sort of thing. Whereas in the States, that would be all something you do outside of school. So this is why parents feel much busier in the US, because you have to do all the extracurricular stuff outside of school. So in New Zealand, they care about the overall rounded person. And they do a lot more with learning through play, as opposed to the US where it's more sit at a desk and take tests, take quizzes. But what I really like also about New Zealand, once you get into the high school, college level, is it's a lot of writing, which requires you to not just have the answer, but to also be able to explain it or maybe critically think about it. Whereas in the US, you do have some of that. But in general, you're going to see a lot more multiple choice tests and you just need to know the information. So knowing the information, applying the information, and being critically analyzing the situation, that's all very different levels of learning. I am a university lecturer by trade, so I'm very familiar with what your students from high school and college need to know when they get to university. And so writing is very key. You can't get away from it. Speaking and writing are very, very important skills. And what I notice about New Zealand is that they do focus a lot on speaking and public speaking from a very young age, which they don't do that in the States. And I think that that's also a lot better. One of the things that I don't think that New Zealand does really great is foreign language. So in the States, you can learn it quite young, like at elementary and primary school, and they don't really do that here. When those are the critical ages, very easy to learn a new language. They learn Te Reo here, which is great, and all my kids learn it, and I love that they're learning it, but they could also be learning other languages around the world, because if they don't end up living in New Zealand, that language isn't going to really help them. So foreign language could be a little bit better. Now, some of their arts and music are a little bit at a smaller scale because maybe of resources or just not a lot of people. But in general, I like how New Zealand will focus on each individual student, what's best for them, where are they at. Very early on, they want to build on what that student is good at and really doing. Whereas in the States, everybody's kind of going through the same thing and it's very standardized. And so it's not very individual focus. So that can make it hard. But in the US, they do obviously a lot of things really right. Push you through subjects, you learn a lot, your knowledge is pretty strong. I would say a disadvantage of what people learn in the States is don't feel like you get a lot of perspective around the world, because in America they think, why would you want to go anywhere else? America's the greatest country on earth. So there's just not a lot of time spent on giving the perspective of other countries, whereas here it's very embraced. I've felt very welcome. I don't know if other people have had that same experience. My kids have people from all over the world in their class. The diversity is very good. A great way to learn about the rest of the world. So I could talk forever, probably about education and some other things. So if you have questions that you'd like me to talk about, or maybe I do another video specifically digging deeper into a subject matter in education, I'm happy to do that. So please leave your comments below and let me know. Subscribe to my channel if this is interesting to you. And I'm happy to answer all of that and do that. So in summary, today we talked about education in New Zealand compared to the US, and we talked about early education before they go to school. We got the primary, we got the intermediate, we got the college, high school age, and then a little bit on my thoughts on education. So have a great day.